Good afternoon, book lovers. We're going to read a little bit more of Abby, Lost at Sea. I hope you're enjoying the adventures of Abby as much as I am. Right now, Abby's going through a little low time, and we all do that, don't we? So let's learn through Abby's low times that God is still in control. Abby walked a long time in the darkening twilight. Although her tears had long since dried, a heavy sadness had settled over her. She had not consciously planned to go to Luke's home, but suddenly there she was at the gate that led up to the whitewashed mansion. Sparks, the collie, whined a greeting and put his muzzle in her hand. She rubbed his head. "Where's Luke, boy?" she asked. The dog seemed to sense her emotion and whined again, prancing back and forth beside her. "Find Luke," Abby commanded, and the collie bounded off toward the barn. Abby followed quickly. She didn't want to be seen by Luke's Aunt Dagmar. She passed the open barn door, and the warm scent of cows filled her nose. The barn was quiet, except for the sound of hay being tossed. In the dim lantern light, Abby could see Luke standing near a huge pile of straw with a pitchfork in hand. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and dug into the pile. Again, she was struck by how much he had grown in the last few months. Years of hard work on the farm had made him muscular and athletic. She knew he loved it, as if his body needed to move. She suspected the work also reminded him of happier days in Pennsylvania, before his ma and pa had died of cholera, before he'd been forced to come live with his aunt. Abby had no idea when she reached out to the lonely stranger at school that he would turn out to be her best and most loyal friend. He didn't care that she had inherited a leg weakness that doctors said would never get better. "Abby, it just slows you down a bit, but you're a lot quicker," and he had said, tapping his forehead, "up here than most." She remembered the first day she'd asked him home for cookies after school. He had jumped up at the offer of friendship as if he were starved for warmth. "Aunt Dagmar runs her home with an iron hand and a silk glove," he'd told her. She'd heard about Dagmar Gronin before Luke arrived and knew she was considered a hard businesswoman. There would never be love to spare at the Gronin mansion, but Abby's family had plenty to share. So began a companionship that had sunk deep roots into both of them. Now Sparks bounded over to Luke, as if he were proud of the present he'd brought his master. Luke paused in his work and saw Abby outlined against the doorway. "Abby, what brings you here this late?" Luke asked. She moved toward him but did not respond. There was a lump in her throat now that she saw him. Luke dropped the pitchfork and strode over to her. "What's wrong?" Then, seeing the look on her face, he grabbed her arm. "Tell me." His voice was brusque. "My uncle's sick. He's asked us to move to Sandwich Islands to help out with his ranch." Luke dropped his arm and turned away. "And your parents are going to move?" He finished her sentence. "Yes, but they want you to come too. Pa's going to talk to your aunt and ask her." Abby spoke rapidly, trying to take away the pain she'd inflicted on him. "She'll never let me go," he said flatly. "Her biggest enjoyment is controlling me. She can't do that if I'm not here." "Oh, Luke," Abby sighed. She needed to talk it all out with her best friend, but everything she said hurt him terribly. "What are we going to do?" she asked as she sank to her knees in the pile of straw. Tears brimmed on her spiky brown eyelashes. Luke kicked the hay and stalked away in silence. He walked over to old Bessie and slapped the cow's rump in irritation. The roan lowed in protest and swung her head around to look at him with liquid eyes while he leaned his head against the Guernsey's warm side. His silence spoke volumes, she realized. He was struggling to regain control. But if Luke had been given to feeling sorry for himself, it would have been a finely developed trait in him by now. She watched him in the dim light. His head finally came up and his shoulders straightened. He walked over and kneeled in the hay next to her. "One thing I know," he said. "You have to make your own way in life. People are always going to let you down or leave you." Abby looked into his handsome face, the straight nose, the strong chin, the blazing green eyes that stared unflinchingly into hers. "Yes," she said slowly, "people do, but God doesn't." She wondered if she truly believed that herself. For years she had followed her parents to church, had sung the hymns, had memorized the Bible verses, but her life had never been tested. Not really, until this moment. Now doubts were piling up like drifts of snow in a winter storm. How could God let this happen? Luke picked up the little cross on her neck and smiled. "I knew my mama's cross would wear well on you. It needed someone who has the kind of faith she had. And that sure ain't me." Abby bit her lower lip. "It might not be me either, Luke," she thought. He walked away, shaking his head. "Come on," he said. "I'll take you home. I know it's too long a walk for you both ways." Grabbing the bridle from the tack room, he fit it cleanly over Lightning's head. In a fluid motion, he leapt up into the bay's back and brought her around to stand next to the hay bale. Abby climbed up on the hay bale and mounted behind him. Just then, thunder boomed overhead, like giant smashing boulders above them. "What about your aunt? You'll be late for supper," she said. "Right now, I don't care about that." He leaned over to blow out the lantern hanging by the door. His voice was tight with restrained anger. The gray shadow of the open barn door had been replaced by inky blackness. They headed out into it. "Hold on tight, Abby. I'm in a mood to gallop." He spurred the horse down the dark lane, and Abby clung hard to Luke's waist as they tore down the road, her hair bouncing wildly behind her. Her curls were going to be an impossible snarl tonight, just like the rest of her life. Then the clouds burst open, and the cold rain slanted across their faces. Luke returned 20 minutes later, soaked to the bone and shivering with cold. He lit the barn lantern and began wiping down Lightning with burlap sacks. The mare snorted and stamped her foot, her side still warm from galloping. Suddenly, a shadow crossed the lantern light. Before he even turned around, he sensed her presence. "You're late." Luke flinched at the sound of Dagmar Ronan's voice. She stood in her black silks, holding a wet black parasol above her head. Her steel gray hair was swept up into a bun at the nape of her neck, but none of this softened her demeanor. Luke had come to notice the slight curl of her upper lip when she caught him doing something for which she could punish him. He knew that she would enjoy the next few moments, for he had given her the perfect opportunity. He was late for supper. In her palace, one did not break with the expected dinner time, or any of the many rules, and get away with it. "I apologize for being late, Aunt Dagmar. It's my fault." He had learned that admitting his mistake right away took some of the starch out of her anger. "You are wet. Don't you dare enter my home dripping. You will take your clothes off here and dry off with the burlap." "But, Aunt, I've got nothing else to put on." Shock made him break with his own rule of quiet acceptance. He thought of Maria the cook and Corbin the butler. He'd have to wear burlap sacks into the house. "You should have thought of that before you decided to delay our scheduled supper." Dagmar brushed a strand of wiry hair from her forehead and sniffed. "Corbin can bring something out for you to wear, but there will be no visiting friends tomorrow." Luke hung his head and balled his fist. When he looked up, his neck cord stood out and his eyes smoldered, but he forced his voice to remain flat. "Whatever you say, Aunt." Dagmar's nose lifted. Luke watched her scrutinize him, and he recognized the joy flooding her cold eyes. She held power over him as his legal guardian. "Good," she said. She clutched her skirt and walked toward the door. As she lifted the parasol higher over her head, she looked back. "You will come to see me, Luke, that I am right. You will come to see, Luke, that I am right. Abide by my rules, and you will someday inherit my wealth. And that could certainly change the life of one penniless orphan boy. She strode out into the rain, soon blending into the blackness. Luke's fist clenched and unclenched while his mind burned. I don't want your ever-loving money, he whispered fiercely. You can keep it. Take it to the grave, for all I care. And that is the end of Chapter 4 of Abby, Lost at Sea, by Pamela Walls. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time for more reading. God bless.